Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss the major bombshells revealed by Rachel Reeves in the House of Commons yesterday. I mean, everyone knew that Labour would claim the Tories hid things from them and the public in terms of the finances as a way of excusing some of the decisions they'd have to make that they'd have rather not talked about during the election. But it was just thought to be part of the usual political games. I thought it would be part of the usual political games. What we didn't realise is that Reeves didn't really have to exaggerate. The Tories actually concealed things from the public, genuinely. And I don't just mean a few details like downplaying the true cost of the Rwanda scheme and similar policies. The Tories actually withheld information from the Office for Budgetary Responsibility ahead of Jeremy Hunt's last budget. Because that's one thing the Tories kept saying is, Labour keeps saying, with the OBR reports, you can't hide things. That was the problem with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget, that they didn't let the OBR check it out first. And so it's like, this is all unfunded. You've got no report saying it's all fine. Like, what's going on? So with the OBR, you can't hide these things. But it's like, but that only works if the Treasury pass on all the information the OBR need. If they withhold things from them, then their report isn't going to be valid. If a Labour government did this, the media would make sure the reputation was destroyed forever. As it is, they're covering for the Tories, so Labour are going to have to work harder to make sure the public know about this. But this is not one party's word against another. I mean, there's documentary proof. It's beyond doubt. In fact, I've listened to Jeremy Hunt after the debate and this morning on an interview show. There's no denial of the figures. So what exactly did the Tories do and what are the consequences? Well, let's go over the accusations from Rachel Reeves first, and then let's take a look at the proof. Reeves announced to the House that the Tories had left the country with a £35.3 billion overspend. That is, they made spending commitments for which there was no money allocated to the tune of £35 billion. So what would have happened if that money was spent? It would have just gone into borrowing. So when Reeves announced the cancellation of some projects, the Tories were complaining as if she'd scrapped them, cut them. But it's not a cut. You're not cutting anything if the money wasn't there in the first place. She was explaining, you didn't allocate any money to it. So I'm not going to be the one to go round the back of the sofa trying to find the money for projects you started, but you didn't think were worthwhile. Like the Tories' promise of 40 new hospitals, for example. Now, sure, we need new hospital buildings, but they've not been built. And the reason they've not been built is because there was not enough money allocated to them. We had officials earlier this year having to admit, not only are these 40 new hospitals not here now, none of them are, by the way, not a single one. But they were asked will any of them be built by 2030? And officials had to sort of say, we don't think so. The money just wasn't given to them. Now, although Reeves says there was a £35 billion overspend, she's talking about the finances having a £22 billion hole in them. The difference is accounted by some projects actually have an underspend, but not very much. There's reserves as well. The reserves have just been blown. And a shortfall that had already been baked in. In fact, on that shortfall already published, this just shows you the scale of the problem. So before the election, I said, look, Labour are going to take a few days in government, then they'll come out and say things are worse than expected. So we're going to have to do a load of stuff we didn't want to talk about during the election. Like raise capital gains tax or pay for a few things. They wouldn't do anything they explicitly ruled out, of course. They've ruled certain things in and out. You don't win elections by reneging on election promises, especially within a few days of that election. And Labour haven't done anything like that here. What Labour are proposing is action that they neither confirmed nor denied before the election. They just didn't want to talk about it. And I also said the Tories would cry foul. They'd say, you knew the state of the finances, you little rascals, you're making things up. And I said Labour would still get away with it because there's always some details that the government will have hidden away, but it wouldn't amount to a great deal. Like, when Yvette Cooper talked about the fact the government, we sort of knew that they'd spent already £400 million on the Rwanda plan. And then Yvette Cooper said, actually, they've spent £700 million. That's like £300 million extra that they'd hidden away. I thought it'd be little details like that, not £35 billion worth. And the reason I thought this is because, unlike with Truss and Kwarteng, Sunak and Hunt did present their budget this spring with an Office for Budgetary Responsibility report. What nobody really expected is it would transpire that Jeremy Hunt would deliberately conceal information from the OBR so that they produce an invalid report. I mean, granted, it was a bit confusing because ahead of that budget that Jeremy Hunt gave, I mean, all the economists were saying there was no room for tax cuts. There's no room for tax cuts. And he announced tax cuts and somehow got the OBR to sort of say, well, it's very tight. You're selling close to the wind, but all right, then okay. It sort of adds up. And, you know, people were going, how? How does it add up? But, you know, we sort of accepted that it sort of did. Even though it was predicated on a load of public spending cuts that were never going to happen. We knew they were going to put the taxes up straight after it. But it's because Jeremy Hunt withheld £35 billion worth of unfunded spending from that report. And to show the scale of this, so the OBR calculated a shortfall of £2.9 billion. So with what Jeremy Hunt did give him, they said, look, you're £3 billion short here, mate. The actual shortfall was 35.3 billion, over 10 times as much. That's the difference here. This is like fraud. And how is this £35 billion made up? Some of the main sources of this phantom funding are £9.4 billion needed to meet the recommendations for public sector pay awards, had zero money allocated to it. Reeves said, for example, the pay awards for teachers was just left on Gillian Keegan's desk for months unattended. Just hadn't even looked at it, done nothing with it. Ministers were literally just leaving things in their intros. I mean, that included, well, no, not included. So on top of that, there's another £2.2 billion from the already agreed pay awards. So the government hadn't even allocated the money to the pay awards they'd already authorised to the tune of £2.2 billion. Then you've got another £9.4 billion for the pay awards being recommended this year, which Labour have said they are going to honour. So what are the Tories supposed to do? Say, well, we might not have honoured them. And yet they try and insist they always honour it, even though they haven't. One of the most shocking was £6.4 billion asylum overspend due to the failure to process claims and the cost of both the wasteful Rwanda scheme and the cost of accommodating an increasing backlog of asylum seekers just being left in limbo. And this was funding that nobody could claim had been revealed. Jeremy Hunt this morning tried to say, oh yeah, but because he didn't deny the figure was right, but he said, oh, but we wouldn't have spent that money because we were sending them all to Rwanda. There's 120,000 people in the backlog. You haven't sent anyone. You sent 4 volunteers to Rwanda. They volunteered. You haven't sent any asylum seekers in this backlog to Rwanda. And those 4 volunteers, by the way, were legally, you could deport them wherever you like. Well, you could deport them back to their country of origin perfectly legally. So they weren't part of the Rwanda plan. Jeremy Hunt, and this £6.4 billion overspend, that's for this year. So it's not even like you could say, oh yeah, over the course of this year, we're going to send 120,000 to Rwanda, which is obviously rubbish. We've got like housing over there for like a few hundred at most. And so where would they go? There's nowhere for them to go. But we're not even talking about across this year because that £6.4 billion overspend, that's not the whole bill. That's the money for which no money was allocated. And that's for this year. So, I mean, that'll be the tax year. So we're already a few months into this tax year. So they'd have to be sending those 120,000 like immediately this month if they're going to get away with this cost. That's what Hunt's trying to suggest. Oh yeah, if it weren't for Labour cancelling the Rwanda plan, they'd all be in Rwanda by now. 120,000? Who believes that? Even people who believe in the Rwanda plan, who believes that? Like, you could argue we knew public sector workers were due pay awards and that the government hadn't said where the money was coming from. Although as no decision was made on those pay awards, the government would just say, well, we don't know what we would have paid them. They could just claim that they would have rejected the recommendations. But like this £6.4 billion overspend for asylum, that was completely hidden. That was off the books. No, they didn't report that to Parliament at all. Nobody knew about it, apart from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. There were a few others as well, such as £2.9 billion given to rail companies to compensate for lower customer numbers in the wake of COVID. Money promised, but no funding allocated. And how do we know it's true? See, how do we know Rachel Reeves hasn't just made it all up, or at least heavily exaggerated? Well, like I say, Jeremy Hunt's not actually questioning the figures themselves. He's only questioning whether or not people knew about them and whether or not it would be, need to be allocated. I'm not going to tell you, look, ministers don't lie to the House after the past few years of Tory ministers doing just that. Although I am going to say the vast majority of MPs would not. But the OBR have now published a letter to the Treasury Committee clerk in which they say they were invited in by the Treasury last week to look at a few things. So they say they'd already complained about the level of transparency from the Treasury recently. In other words, what the letter's basically saying is, look, we suspected Jeremy Hunt wasn't being completely clear with us, right? Not completely straight. The new Chancellor's been happy to show us proof, as well as make sure there's greater transparency when it comes to her budgets. And so they're going to be launching an inquiry now as well. We're getting that budget on October the 30th. Some things were announced in this one. One of which was that the government will honour the recommendation of public sector pay, which I said, which includes above inflation pay awards at last. We already know that the government have agreed to a 22% pay increase for junior doctors over 2 years. That'll go a long way towards getting their pay back to the level it was under the last Labour government. Still more to go. So we should be looking at a trajectory for all public sector workers doing the same. Remember, although if that sounds like a large pay award for junior doctors, they were the most shafted by the Tories, because it's by far the easiest way to destroy the NHS. Just, reduce doctors' pay down to the point where you get paid more for working in Costa Coffee, literally. The winter fuel allowance also been means tested. Now, there are things about that. The Tories are claiming Labour are leaving the most vulnerable without help this winter. The reality is that Reeves actually announced the most vulnerable get 50% higher payments. Any pension in receipt of means tested benefits, including pension credit, gets the payment. And those aged 8 or older will get 50% higher payments. There are some people who have reasonable concerns about this, but the concerns are not about means testing it, about where that means testing falls. So you could suggest, Martin Lewis has already come out and suggested a way of making sure you don't make some people just on the threshold suffer. That would be worth looking at. But what's actually happened here is a universal benefit has been made means tested, and the value of it increased for the most vulnerable in broad terms. If you've got a budget crisis, I mean, that's something to do. There are plenty of pensioners who don't need that £200. Reeves also carried on laying the groundwork for extra tax rises. So all those people going, oh yeah, but what about taxing the rich? Yeah, that was already coming. So the focus remains on capital gains tax, as well as potentially a few reforms to the system, which economists think could free up extra spending. The government have just launched a review into private equity taxation. So, in terms of taxing the rich, stuff is coming. Of course, a lot of the budget in October will depend on whether the economy continues to improve or not, in terms of the old fiscal headroom, as it's called. But we can worry about this autumn. For now, what we've got here is a genuine smoking gun. The Tories have behaved like pirates in the last Parliament. Don't get me wrong, I've always argued that their economic ideas are provably wrong. But they at least had belief in them themselves. What happened in the last Parliament wasn't ideology, it was literal piracy. They began with what they knew would be a ruinous hard Brexit. They knew that. They didn't believe Brexit was going to be good for the economy. They knew it would be bad. They did it anyway, purely for the sake of keeping their ratty party together. Then the VIP lane, a way of callously choosing personal greed over their duty to the country and its people. And they've continued in this vein throughout, culminating in the last year when, knowing they were going to lose the election, they simply began scorched earth policy, salting the earth. But although people will say they were salting the earth for Labour, that's their intention. That's not what they've done. They've salted the earth for all of us. They were like a thief who stole a credit card, then ran up as much debt as they could before the card was cancelled. That's what's happened here. And if Labour can get that message through to the public, won't be easy with the media covering, then we might finally get some people to see the most effective lie the Tories ever told, that they are the party of fiscal responsibility and economic competence. No, they're not. And this is not just about a few dodgy characters at the top of the Tory party. Reeves laid all this out to Parliament yesterday. And yet all Tory MPs could do during the debate, which lasted a long time, even the ones who will have been innocent, is tried to blame others, including officials. If the party was fundamentally sound and was just run by a few dodgy characters, its own MPs would have been as appalled as everyone else. But they knew they were led by pirates. They won't have known the full scale of the piracy. They knew it was happening and they were comfortable with it. We could do with the public seeing that. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.